Welcome to Logic. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we're going to be talking about what an argument is. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can understand arguments in terms of their structure and their type. So let's remind ourselves that what logic is the study, the formal study of human reasoning. And the very foundational part of what all of this is what we call an argument. And so what I want to do in this presentation is I want to highlight what some of the essential elements of an argument are in terms of their structure and how they're important for our form of reasoning. And we're going to examine the components that constitute an argument so we can better understand how it is that we're actually able to communicate information in a rational way by providing reasons when we talk with people. Both in ordinary language, but it's also an essential element within the sciences and with all of human life. So we need to talk about what an argument is. So logic is the science and the study of argumentation. So an argument has components. And we're going to see that the two basic types of components that an argument has is what we call a premise and a conclusion. But before we get into that, I want you to think about an argument in a very simple way. An argument is whenever we offer a claim and then we provide reasons to support that claim. So I want you to think of an argument in a very, very simple sense as we begin the course. If I tell you to bring your umbrella because it's going to rain later today, right? I'm providing a claim, bring your umbrella, and I'm giving you reasons why. The reason is because I'm asserting that it's going to rain. Now, we're going to ignore the question of whether or not ultimately that's a good or a bad argument, but anytime we do that in human language, this is what an argument is. So we have to understand these two basic components and these two sides of what an argument are: the claim and the reason givingness of a claim. Now, when I talk about an argument, of course, what I don't mean is talking about getting into a conflict with other people. We, of course, get into arguments with each other, but that's not what we mean in logic. We're not talking about conflicts or disputes. We're rather talking about the frameworks that we use to convey information. Additionally, an argument is also a way in which we can infer new information from information that we have. So an argument has an essential structure. The essential structure is that, number one, an argument has a conclusion. The conclusion is the claim that we're making. And number two, an argument has premises. These are the reasons that provide support, or the evidence that provides support for the conclusion. So here's an example of an argument. All dogs are mammals. All mammals are warm-blooded. Therefore, all dogs are warm-blooded. Right, so this is an argument in which there's two parts. The first part are the two premises: all dogs are mammals and all mammals are warm-blooded. And then the second part the last part is the conclusion that all dogs are warm-blooded. So this is what we call a categorical syllogism. We'll get into all of that later. I just want you to see the central structure, that there are premises and a conclusion. Also notice that in the example here, I'm using a visual format to help us understand this, where I'm listing the premises first, I'm putting a line, and then below the line is my conclusion. So the claim is the conclusion, and the reasons or evidence are the premises. Now, an argument will always have one conclusion, but there could be multiple premises. So that's important to recognize, that sometimes you can just have one premise and then a conclusion, or you can have multiple. Most of the time, there's usually at least two premises on most arguments, because you have to convey more information than a single premise usually. But it is indeed possible. So how do we figure out what the conclusion is versus what the premises of an argument are? Well, in ordinary human language, we provide what are called premise and conclusion indicator terms. So a premise indicator term is any word or phrase that signals to the listener or the reader what the premise is, or it signals that you're conveying a reason to support some sort of idea. Words like because, since, given that, assuming that, for, as, due to the fact that, all of these are examples of words or phrases that tell us what is a premise. let me give you an example. Take one of these examples. Take the word because. Let's go back to our earlier argument and let's insert the word because and see how it works. Imagine if I start with the conclusion, I say, all dogs are warm-blooded because all dogs are mammals and all mammals are warm-blooded. Notice how the word because, whatever follows the word because, signals to your listener, to your reader, that you're actually providing a reason for the claim. So you're signaling a premise. The same thing works with the conclusion indicator terms. So here are some of what those look like. Therefore, thus, so, hence, it follows that, which means that, accordingly, we may conclude, and there are many others which we might signal. So let's use the word so, and let's try the same example. All dogs are mammals, all mammals are warm-blooded, so all dogs are warm-blooded. Notice here how the word so, when I insert it, whatever follows the word so, tells me what the conclusion is. Now, it's very common in human language that we actually mix up the premises and the conclusion. So when I'm giving you an argument in real life, let's say we meet, we're just talking on the street, and I give you a claim and I give you some reasons for that claim. I may give you the conclusion first and then the premises. I may give you a premise, then the conclusion, then another premise. We can mix it all up. This is because human language is actually quite variable. And we're actually able to do a lot with our human language. So what we tend to do in logic is try to figure out what the premises are and what the conclusion is, and then organize it in a way that helps us make sense of it and helps clarify things. So this means that one of the things we're going to see as the course continues is we're going to increasingly see a use in the role of symbols. We're going to symbolize things. I gave the example earlier that when we draw a line in logic and we put the conclusion below it, that line signals or indicates what the conclusion is. Here's another example. Here's an argument which says all A or B, all B or C, therefore all A or C. So these three dots here, it kind of looks like the corners of a triangle. These three dots in logic are a symbol which indicate the conclusion. So they're a lot like a conclusion indicator term, except it's not a term, it's just a symbol. So it's a conclusion indicator symbol. So we're going to see lots of different symbols, and we're going to introduce symbols. In order to do this, or the reason we do this, is just to help us clarify what's what in a very quick way. Generally speaking, without having to write the word therefore over and over. Now, we have to talk a little bit about how arguments work. So we already know that an argument has sets of premises, has reasons, and it has a conclusion. But how are the two related? The relationship between the premises and a conclusion is what we call an inference. Inference refers to the logical transition from the premises to a conclusion where we establish a direct connection between the two. And we can inference in deductive reasoning, which is a type of reasoning we're going to learn about. This connection, the inference, is an absolute connection, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion always has to be true. And that demonstrates a necessary relationship between the two. If I say that all human beings, all people are mortal, and Socrates is a person, it therefore follows what? You could probably fill in the answer yourself. It follows that Socrates is also mortal. Now, that means that the reasons I give, all people are mortal and Socrates is a person, those reasons are enough for us to draw out, as it were, a necessary idea, a new idea, and the connection between the two is tied together, stitched together in a way, in a relationship that's a necessary relationship. Now, not all arguments use necessary inferences, but some use inferences of probability, for instance. But we have to understand that this is ultimately what logic is interested in, is understanding these sorts of inferences. And in formal logic, we're going to be really focused in our study on the deductive inference that's possible between the premises and conclusion of an argument. Why? Because the deductive inference guarantees that the truth of the premises ensures the truth of the conclusion. It's like the gold standard of logical reasoning. And that means that the strength of an inference ultimately gets judged by how necessary the conclusion follows from the premises. If it doesn't follow necessarily, then it's what we call an invalid argument. And if it does follow, it ultimately ends up being a valid argument. We'll talk more about validity and invalidity later. I don't want you focused or worried too much about what that means. We'll define that very specifically. But put it this way, a valid argument is a logical argument. And this is what we'll be studying. Now, the question is, how does this work? How does inference work? And this is the concept of truth functionality. Think about it this way. Every argument is made up of statements or propositions. As we learned earlier, a proposition is any statement that can be true or false, right? So that's not questions, not commands, not ceremonial expressions, things like that, but any proposition that asserts something that can either be true or false, at least hypothetically, right? So that means that a proposition can have a truth value. So if I say that all people are mortal, that statement has a truth value. That statement is true, for instance. If I say that Socrates was a person, that statement's also true. Now, when we make an inference between the premises and the conclusion, that inference is not just a necessary relationship, but the necessary relationship is such that the truth of the premises ensures that the conclusion is also true. So that means that the argument is truth functional. Think of it as this idea that truth can flow from the premises down to the conclusion, which means that it's really important. The structure of an argument is very, very important, because if the structure of an argument is organized incorrectly, then that means it can't be truth functional, such that even if the premises are true, the conclusion might actually turn out to be false. Or put it this way, that people might give reasons, they might give premises that are true, but the way in which they have organized the structure of their argument is such that the truth of the conclusion is just independent, has really nothing to do with the premises. So what logicians study, what we'll be studying, is using symbols to isolate the formal structure of arguments in order to identify this truth functional relationship. Now, this is really important because it means that we can apply this concept of truth functionality to actually evaluate arguments, regardless of what the arguments are about. Regardless if we're talking about people or dogs or mammals or politicians, etc., ultimately the form of which we make these arguments is critical and essential to the truth functionality of the arguments. And we'll actually discover that there are common logical forms. There are certain types of argument structures which recur over and over again in all kinds of discourses. And in fact, we'll even learn how to identify these common argument forms and use them in order to prove that other arguments are actually valid. So that means that we can talk a little bit about there must be different types of arguments. So at this point, we'll say that deductive arguments are those arguments where there's a necessary link between the premises and the conclusion. Other types of arguments include what are called inductive arguments, which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is really one of probability. You also have abductive arguments, which is a little bit fuzzy to explain. We're not going to really learn or focus on it in this course, but we can say this, is that abductive arguments are arguments which support explanations in reasoning. But in this course, we're going to focus principally on deductive logic. And we'll talk about a little bit about the different methods of reasoning for creating deductive arguments, as well as inductive and abductive arguments. So what are some of the key takeaways that I want you to have learned, hopefully, from watching this video and reading this section? I want you to understand that the structure and the types of arguments that we use in our discourse are essential for us to articulate, number one, ideas in which the reasons we give are sufficient to the conclusions we make. And this is essential for what we generally call critical thinking and good human reasoning. It's also important because as we study law, everywhere we go, we're confronted with arguments. People are always trying to convince us to believe things. Think about if you're watching television and you see an advertisement. And the advertisement tells you need to buy this product, and then they give you reasons for why. Logic is important for understanding the how and when arguments actually make sense and when they don't. Human beings can easily get mixed up in reasoning, and particularly if people organize the conclusions and the premises out of order, or they use different words to refer to the same propositions. It's very easy for us to get quickly confused. And so what logicians do is study the way in which this is possible. So that way, ultimately, we can have better arguments ourselves, and we can master them in our own discourses. It's worth mentioning that Aristotle, when he really formulates logic in the 4th century BCE, Aristotle sees logic as a tool that we can use to actually advance science. And keep in mind here that science depends upon logic. Because if scientists are making inferences based upon observations, they have to do it in a way where their inferences are actually truth functional. But Aristotle's view is that we can use logic to generate new knowledge. So put it this way, logic is the engine by which we can advance human reasoning and human knowledge. So what arguments are? Arguments are claims where they have support and evidence and reasons. They have premises and conclusions. With that said, I hope this gives you a little bit more understanding about what an argument is in terms of their structure fundamentally, and maybe what some of the different types of arguments are which are possible. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys online.